Major funding for this program was provided by the W. Alton Jones Foundation, the North Shore Unitarian Universalist Beach Program, the Charles A. Fruoff Foundation, the Herman Goldman Foundation, and the Albert A. List Foundation. Additional funding was provided by the following foundations and individuals.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President has just announced full acceptance of the unconditional surrender terms by the Japanese.
Having found the atomic bomb, we have used it. It is an awful responsibility which has come to us. We thank God that it has come to us instead of to our enemies. And we pray that He may guide us to use it in His ways and for His purposes.
More than 4 decades have passed since nuclear weapons were first used. There can be little doubt that the greatest challenge we face today is making sure they are never used again. This program will examine 4 different policy options. Option 1 argues for military superiority. Option 2 makes the case for arms control. A third for building missile defenses. And the fourth for eliminating all nuclear weapons. These options are not always neat or clean-cut. Sometimes one will overlap another. Even the experts may fall into more than one category. But these 4 options lie at the heart of the present national security debate, and one way or another, they may very well end up shaping our future. The United States and the Soviet Union have entrusted their security to ever-increasing nuclear arsenals. Today, they have 50,000 nuclear weapons between them. What should our security depend on in the future? The pursuit of military superiority? Arms control agreements designed to limit the arsenals and manage the arms race? New technology that will defend us against ballistic missiles? Or the abolition of all nuclear weapons? This explosion is something new. It is the deliberate destruction of one of an entire class of missiles the U.S. and the Soviet Union are eliminating, in keeping with the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty they signed in December of 1987. For the first time, the 2 powers are actually reducing their arsenals. They have accepted unprecedented on-site verification procedures. In addition, there is serious talk about cutting strategic weapons by 50% in the START negotiations. And this cutback, according to the 1986 statements by President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev at the Reykjavik summit, is only halfway to the more distant goal of complete nuclear disarmament. These developments come at a time of change in Soviet foreign policy, withdrawal from Afghanistan, and talk of new military thinking that might lead to deep cuts in conventional as well as nuclear weapons. Profound domestic changes also appear to be underway. Glasnost, a new openness, and perestroika, a restructuring of economic relationships, recently confirmed at the first Soviet Party conference held since Stalin. It is against this backdrop of new arms control initiatives and changes in Soviet domestic and foreign policy that we are presenting our 4 options for national security. The first option argues that the U.S. has lost and must now reclaim the military superiority it enjoyed after World War II. Some people call this option peace through strength. It grows out of the old Roman saying, if you want peace, prepare for war. In today's world, that means military superiority over an adversary still seen as dedicated to world domination.
It is a policy, a doctrine, an ideology that is inimical to our interests and to the values that we have as a free and democratic society.
They do not necessarily want to start a war, but they want to coerce, and if the situation ever appeared to them propitious, they have no moral qualms against the war. They have no moral qualms against killing large numbers of their own people, and they would have no moral qualms against killing the rest of us.
What bothers me is when President Reagan says that there's a fundamental change in the Soviet Union, that Gorbachev is a totally different leader from all the others, that the Soviet Union is not interested in world conquest anymore. I don't know where he gets all this from, unless it be just personal impressions of a very agreeable individual, which Gorbachev, I think, is. I think this is dangerous.
U.S.-Soviet antagonism has fueled an arms race unprecedented in history. The hydrogen bomb, ballistic missiles, armadas of planes, ships, submarines, tanks, helicopters, and millions of soldiers. The advocates of peace through strength argue that the U.S. is losing this race, that the Soviets have built a nuclear missile force that could destroy the American nuclear force in a disarming first strike.
As time goes by, the degree to which they can disarm us increases. At what point the Soviets will find that sufficient will depend on the circumstances. Only one thing is clear. As time is passing, they are becoming ever more able to strike and then to protect themselves.
They've invested an enormous amount of money and effort and talent in building this force. And they want to use it as a threat of the first strike, and not for deterrent purposes.
This film excerpt dramatizes the American vulnerability to a Soviet first strike that some analysts believe the U.S. faces.
34 minutes into the attack, the strategic forces of the United States have suffered a crippling blow.
Let's enable the missiles. Program
Of the 1,000 Minuteman missiles, only 46 remain operational.
Oh my God, we've had a nuclear detonation. What do you want me to do? What's happening?
Of the 330 B-52 bombers, all but 22 have been destroyed on the ground. Of the 41 ballistic missile submarines, 17 have been destroyed in port, and an unknown number are presumed lost at sea. The United States has given an ultimatum. Any attempt at retaliation will result in the certain annihilation of America's urban population. 9 minutes later, the President orders all surviving U.S. forces to cease fire.
The proponents of peace through strength argue that in this pursuit of a first strike capability, the Soviets have not honored arms control agreements.
The arms control process has given the American people the false belief that the Soviet Union is willing to do us a favor, that it is willing to abide by a piece of paper that would obviate all of the things that they have worked so hard to achieve.
We have seen time after time after time the compromises we've made to fashion an agreement with them, sundered by Soviet unilateral steps that effectively breach the provisions of the agreements that they don't care about.
The Soviet record of treaty compliance is consistent. It is a consistent record of violations, but even more important than violations, it is a consistent record of circumvention. It is a record of achieving precisely the ends that the United States sought to foreclose by entering into the treaties.
We are not worried about the huge arsenal of nuclear weapons that the French have, and the English have, and even the Chinese have, because we are not in inimical situations. We have no armed forces guarding our frontier of Canada, because we have good relations. I think if and when we have good relations with the Soviet Union, then these weapons will not threaten us. And to start with weapons, the controlling weapons or diminishing the numbers of weapons is to some extent very deceptive. It gives you an illusion of things getting better when in fact they aren't.
The military buildup of the Reagan administration was pushed by the proponents of peace through strength. Since 1980, the U.S. has spent over $2 trillion on defense, about $21,000 per American household. The nuclear weapons portion of the defense budget doubled during the Reagan era and includes long-term commitments to several new weapons systems: the MX missile, the B-1 bomber, the stealth bomber, the Trident submarine and Trident missile, new stealth cruise missiles, and as many as a dozen new types of warheads. This film, made for a group called the Coalition for Peace Through Strength, says that the buildup must continue.
We are inferior in military power and defense, inept in propaganda, indecisive in third world struggles, and disunited at home. Strategists agree that a first priority must be restoration of America's military strength to reduce the risk of war.
There is no shortcut. There is no easy path. One must present the prospective attacker with a serious prospect that he will lose. Not only that he will not fail to gain very much, but that he will lose, that he will be defeated.
Peace through strength is the only way to deal with the Russians. I mean, all experience indicates it. They understand strength, they value strength, they interpret strength as vitality, as intelligence. That's how they judge themselves, and that's how they judge others.
We must regain the ability to fight, survive, and win wars, and then maintain it.
Throughout history, war has always been used to settle differences among nations. But within months after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Bernard Brodie, who would become a leading Pentagon strategist, began to argue that nuclear weapons made a clean break with history. Thus far, he wrote in early 1946, "The chief purpose of our military establishment has been to win wars. From now on, its chief purpose must be to avert them. It can have almost no other useful purpose." Our second option for national security accepts this concept of nuclear deterrence that Brodie described more than 40 years ago. Its proponents try to manage the nuclear standoff with arms control agreements. They believe that by limiting new technologies and by limiting the number of these weapons, they can maintain a condition of stable deterrence that will not, they hope, break down into war.
I would prefer superiority over the Soviet Union to either inferiority or equality. Sounds better to me. The question in the nuclear age is, what is it? What does it mean? Is it affordable? Is it plausible? Could you have it? If we had 100,000 nuclear weapons and the Soviet Union could still deliver 3,000 nuclear weapons to the United States, just 3,000, would we win a nuclear war? No. We would both lose, and indeed we'd both lose about equally badly. So superiority, though desirable for the warm, fuzzy feeling it gives you in your belly, and because it's the traditional way of thinking about security problems, in this nuclear age nowadays, is simply unachievable.
I don't believe either side is capable of, nor has either side achieved, any strategic advantage. Basically, what deters the sides is the knowledge that were they to attempt to employ nuclear weapons and perhaps attempt to disarm the other side, there would be more than adequate numbers of nuclear weapons remaining on the other side to destroy the attacker.
Whoever attacks first is really committing suicide. That's what deterrence is. It's a terrible way to live in the modern world. To think after all these years of human sweat and genius, we live as bare as nuclear hostages of one another is not a very attractive, it's not a very safe condition. It has no historical precedent.
Believing that the use of nuclear weapons would be suicidal, arms controllers try to bring stability to the mutual hostage relationship.
What arms control can do for you is establish a framework wherein you have a certain amount of predictability, a certain amount of restraint, and a certain amount of confidence in the ability of your forces to survive any kind of a crisis situation.
We are now much less secure than we were 40 years ago, than we were 20 years ago, and than we were 10 years ago. And this, the only way is to understand that we would be mutually secured if we would consider these armaments as our common enemy.
We fundamentally understand that our security is linked to that of the Soviet Union. And they, I think, understand that their security is linked to our own. Yet, we are not operating in an environment or in a relationship of trust.
The reason the pace of arms control negotiations is so slow is that we're dealing with an adversary we don't trust, and therefore we have to be careful to negotiate provisions that we are confident are being obeyed, or if they are being violated, we are confident that we will detect any militarily or strategically significant violation.
Each of our societies can gain, East and West can gain, if we move to reduce political tensions and the danger that political tensions will erupt into military confrontation.
Robert S. McNamara was Secretary of Defense during the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 10 tense days in October of 1962, the world appeared to be on the brink of a nuclear war.
As I left the White House on Saturday evening, I believe it was the 26th of October, perfectly beautiful fall night, walked through the Rose Garden to my car to go back to the Pentagon, I felt I might never live to see another Saturday evening. Now, I know that sounds melodramatic, but that is a fair reflection of the mood of those of us who were responsible for the decision-making at the time.
After the two powers looked into the nuclear abyss during the Cuban Missile Crisis, arms control efforts began in earnest. Within a year came the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963 that banned atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons. In 1972 came the SALT Agreement that limited the number of offensive missiles and the development of anti-ballistic missile systems. SALT II in 1979 added more restrictions. And the INF Treaty of 1987 eliminates an entire class of weapons. Despite these agreements, the strategic arsenals are 4 times larger than when all these negotiations began, and many innovations in weapons design have been introduced.
If you were to take the current security system and try to describe it to a Rip Van Winkle, who might have been asleep since World War II, he'd find it hard to believe that the way that we ensure our security is by threatening to destroy the human species. That wouldn't sound very sensible, and it wasn't really planned that way. Arms control has not shaped it very much.
Arms control has been asked to do a great deal. One of the things it's been asked to do is to try to constrain the growth of technology. That, again, runs contrary to sort of the basic American drive, which is that technology is a great thing.
Arms controllers try to constrain technology but differ over what should be limited. At one end of the spectrum are those who say innovation can create a more stable deterrence. They cite developments that have made missiles more survivable, deploying them in buried silos and on submarines at sea. They advocate more weapons modernization, mobile missiles, stealth bombers, quieter submarines. At the other end of the spectrum are those who see modernization as a Pandora's box. They cite destabilizing innovations like multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. A missile with many warheads has a great advantage if it strikes first. For that reason, it becomes a prime target, inviting attack by the other side early in a crisis. This is one of 692 U.S. underground nuclear weapons tests. Testing has been the focus of bitter controversy over the role of innovation for 25 years, because new warheads cannot be designed without testing. Those who want to restrict new weapons design favor a comprehensive test ban. Those who see a need to design new warheads favor continued testing.
If we cease nuclear testing, either by a moratorium or by congressional mandate or treaty, that would really injure very severely our security interests.
The Reagan administration really opposes a test ban because it wants to continue testing and developing new nuclear weapons for warfighting. But it doesn't want to admit this in public.
Our opponents would know that we were not allowed to test. We would not be able to verify whether they were adhering to it or not, and they violated other treaties rather systematically. And it would prevent all the necessary modernization. And we think in every way that, or the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, would have really the opposite effect that its sponsors intend.
We will still be able to destroy the Soviet Union several times over. The Soviets will be able to destroy us several times over. Isn't that enough to deter an attack? Reliability and safety are not the problem. They are just more excuses for continuing the arms race. It is time to put the Reagan administration nuclear arms policy to bed.
Just as there is controversy over how much to limit innovation, there are sharp differences over how much to limit the numbers of nuclear weapons.
Deterrence really is in the eye of the beholder. The problem is that the concept is really a psychological one. What do you need to do to convince the Soviet Union, the collective entity, its general secretary and its military officers, that they cannot win? That's a very hard question to answer. I can probably deter war for any calculated purpose on a clear blue day by just having a few nuclear weapons, because there are not that many things that you're going to go after that it's worth it to risk even the annihilation that a few nuclear weapons would bring about. But when you start to ask yourself in a hot crisis, with vital interests on the line, perhaps stability in Eastern Europe on the line, now what do you need to convince the other side that they can't win? That might be a very different number and a different set of options than what you need on a clear blue day.
How many weapons you'll want depends on the strategy you choose to deter the other side. If you think that threatening the destruction of your opponent's cities is enough to deter, then all you need is a few. However, if you believe the other side might try to destroy your weapons in a first strike, you may want several hundred so some will survive. If you think you need to threaten your opponent's nuclear forces and other military targets, then a few thousand may be necessary. And if you think you need to show you can fight limited nuclear wars or can use nuclear weapons on the battlefield, then tens of thousands may be required.
In the long run, our objective should be to move away from a world of 50,000 nuclear warheads to a world of a few tens, or at most a few hundreds. I think that's achievable. And it would be a world in which we had almost eliminated this terrible risk that we face today of nuclear war, destroying our civilization.
McNamara's understanding of the Cuban Missile Crisis made him an advocate of having few nuclear weapons, of so-called minimum deterrence.
At the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had on the order of 5,000 strategic offensive nuclear warheads. The Soviets had on the order of 300. We had a ratio advantage of some 17-to-1. Suppose we launched 5,000 against 300, and say even 10% of them survived. And I think, frankly, many more than 10% would have. 10% of 330, 30 nuclear warheads could have destroyed tens of millions of Americans. We were deterred by that reason alone, forgetting the moral considerations. We were deterred by that reason alone from using our superior force, our 17-1 advantage against them.
Many arms controllers do not favor minimum deterrence. They argue that if you have a small number of weapons, you do not have enough to target military forces and must therefore target cities.
Now, the problems with minimum deterrence are, first of all, there's the ethical problem. Are you sure that the way you want to deter is by targeting cities on the other side where the innocent people are concentrated intentionally, that that's your objective, is to threaten to kill them as a means of deterrence? So there's an ethical problem. There's a military problem. Would you do it, knowing that what you leave standing on the other side is the adversary's ability to destroy all of your cities? Is that a credible threat?
Military strategy for Europe is at the center of the debate over how many nuclear weapons are needed to deter. The U.S. currently has thousands of nuclear weapons in Europe and a policy of having the option to use them first if war breaks out.
80% of Americans believe that our government will never initiate the use of nuclear weapons except in response to a Soviet nuclear attack. They're absolutely wrong. NATO's strategy is based on the opposite premise, that we, NATO, we the U.S. and NATO, will initiate the use of nuclear weapons in response to a Soviet conventional force attack.
If I were a Soviet general considering for a moment conventional aggression, say, into Western Europe, I would notice and take into account that the Allies have thousands of nuclear weapons there, and that there would be a substantial chance that this war would escalate into a nuclear war, and that would contribute to discouraging me from starting the conventional war.
Today, when the nuclear forces on both sides are approximately equal in numbers and certainly equal in military capability, there's no possible way we the West could initiate the use of nuclear weapons without the high probability of destroying our civilization. And therefore, in fact, we have a bankrupt nuclear strategy.
I do not mean to imply for one moment that the current situation with 50,000 nuclear weapons is satisfactory and is a long-term solution to our security dilemma. I share the view held by many that the chance of this deterrent system working for the next 50 years, say, without catastrophic failure is small. In any event, the odds against us are too great to bet our planet.
Arms controllers do not particularly like the world of deterrence, a world kept from destruction by threatening destruction. They just see no alternative. For most Americans, this condition goes against the grain of common sense and the simple desire to feel secure. Our third option sees a way out in the traditional American faith in technology. Its advocates trust more in the certainties they find in science than in the uncertainties of negotiations. Their goal is to bring about a transition from today's strategy, which relies on offensive weapons, to a new arrangement of forces that relies on defenses. This view, officially called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, is popularly known as Star Wars. Advocates see it as a way to escape deterrence, the world of mutual assured destruction, often referred to as MAD.
It's like the cowboy saying, all right, if you get in the first shot and kill me, I've got my gun trained on your wife and children. I'm going to blow them away. That's mad. I mean, that's really mad. And that's what we're stuck with until we get some defenses deployed.
Many years ago, Oppenheimer made a very striking and very correct comparison. Offense alone is like two scorpions in a bottle. We have to get away from that. And at last we are starting to work on defense. I believe defense is always preferable, because in that way, neither side will feel the need to strike first.
There will be a technologically brokered transition from offense domination to defense domination, in which it will simply become cheaper and more militarily effective, compelled, if you will, by both economics and military considerations, to defend than it is to attack.
The goals of strategic defense were set forth by President Reagan in a speech in March of 1983.
I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
I asked my daddy what this Star Wars stuff is all about. He said that right now we can't protect ourselves from nuclear weapons. And that's why the president wants to build the peace shield. It would stop missiles in outer space so they couldn't hit our house. Then nobody could win a war. And if nobody could win a war, there's no reason to start one. My daddy's smart.
Most visions of SDI foresee a layered system designed to destroy Soviet ICBMs in 3 phases. During the 3 to 5 minute boost phase, when all of the warheads are still in the missiles. During the 20 to 25 minute mid-course phase, when a cloud of warheads are released and flying through space. And during the 1 to 2 minute terminal phase, when the warheads are streaking through the atmosphere toward their targets in the U.S. A variety of sensors, communication systems, computers, and weapons are being designed to accomplish these tasks. Near-term technologies rely on rockets or interceptors, which directly hit their targets or get close enough to destroy them with a conventional explosion. More futuristic technologies include lasers, particle beams, electromagnetic railguns, and even X-ray lasers pumped by hydrogen bombs. This multi-layered defense always works perfectly in artist drawings.
Now to defend one's society against nuclear weapons that release 1 million times more energy than previous bombs, the standard of a defense that you require to be effective is much higher. You have to essentially defend yourself perfectly. Otherwise, the first bomb that drops on San Francisco out here, that's the end of San Francisco.
Complicating an attack is what defenses are all about. They will never be 100.000% perfect. Nothing in the world is. But we buy many, many, many imperfect things, including many things in the national security area.
The impenetrable shield that ultimately replaces deterrence, President Reagan's original vision, has basically changed.
What you've come to hear more recently, however, is discussion of having defenses not to transcend deterrence, as the President has always spoken about, but rather to enhance it. That instead of trying to reach a world where we didn't have to rely upon avenging lives rather than saving them, this is going to be to improve our ability to avenge them. That's what protecting our retaliatory forces does. That's not moving beyond deterrence. That's strengthening deterrence.
Deterrence is not a proposition of revenge. SDI, to me, has always had as its fundamental mission, prevent the war from ever happening. By saying to any Soviet that might think that he could carry out a deliberate strike, to say, I dare not, because I don't know what damage I will do. The Americans are going to stop so many of these missiles that I don't know what the results will be. Therefore, I'm not going to attack.
This test demonstration of a laser destroying a Titan missile shell was part of the SDI research effort that has already consumed over $13 billion. SDI now commands over 10% of all defense research funding, and nearly 500 companies in 45 states have SDI research contracts. Despite this investment, SDI still generates strong disagreement over its technical feasibility.
I don't know now of any technology, nor do I see one to the limit of my technical vision, let's say to the end of this century. I don't see how one can build an effective defense.
The scientist who says we can't do it, they can't do it. The scientists say we can do it, they can do it. And that's not flip. That's the way it always has been. For every Orville right, there's always been an Orville wrong who says he can't fly an airplane.
For SDI to work, it must contend with countermeasures. The Soviets could compromise SDI by switching to fast-burn boosters, hardening their missiles, directly attacking space-based components of SDI, or simply by deploying more decoys.
I'm an optimist, technically. I believe that if you give us a technical challenge, we can master it. But here we're talking about not man against nature, which is a technical challenge. We're talking about man against man, what you do against the countermeasures of your opponent. It was a technical problem to put a man on the moon, because the moon didn't object to being landed on. But if the moon were going to shoot back or run away or put out moon decoys, then it's a different problem.
If you enough stupid to develop such system, because I think it is against your own interest, our response is much more efficient, and this response is the countermeasure. Passive, active altogether. And it is very well known. It's not any secret in this.
They say that it will develop cheap countermeasures, but we've already said that we won't deploy a system that can be readily countermeasured. They say that they will overwhelm us by proliferating their offense, but we've already said that we won't deploy a system. It is not cheaper to operate in a defensive mode than it is cheaper to overwhelm.
A major attraction of SDI is its vision of a safer world. But many critics argue that SDI would make the world less safe by giving the U.S. a first strike advantage. A nation that has even a modest defense could attack first, decimate the enemy's nuclear force, and then use its defense to defeat the ragged retaliation.
Most dangerous situation would be to allow to potential aggressor to make a preemptive strike and then to hide himself behind defensive shield against substantially weakened retaliatory strikes.
Now, against which kind of an attack, that first strike or that second strike, are defenses likely to be more effective? They're likely to be more effective against the ragged, poorly coordinated, ill-timed, expected retaliatory attack. So by and large, if you look at roughly equal defenses on both sides that are not miraculously effective defenses, but just what you might expect out of military systems. They tend to increase the incentive to strike first rather than decrease it.
An ability to defend yourself deters an attack. It does not invite an attack, and total vulnerability tends to invite an attack.
What matters with a nuclear weapon or a nuclear system is not whether you call it offensive or defensive. It matters whether it contributes to a stability based upon the clear knowledge that there's no advantage to initiating nuclear war.
Ballistic missile defense systems were actually built in the U.S. and the Soviet Union in the 1960s. But fearing that defensive systems would force each side to build more offensive weapons, they agreed to limit missile defense in the Anti-Ballistic Missile, or ABM, Treaty of 1972. The Soviets kept their one permitted anti-ballistic missile system around Moscow, while the U.S. abandoned its site in Grand Forks, North Dakota in 1975. For SDI now to proceed, the ABM Treaty would have to be radically changed.
Soviets never bought the basic premise behind the ABM Treaty. And they so stated at the time. They said that the notion of mutual assured destruction, that is, that you should leave yourself open to attack, was bourgeois naivete. I mean, they said so in no uncertain terms. They're quite correct. It was bourgeois because we were trying to save money, and naive to believe that the Soviet Union would go along with the idea that they shouldn't defend themselves.
I'll always choose technology over the paper. Not only is the negotiating process slow and unreliable, but as has been documented to the satisfaction of every serious politician in Washington, the Soviet record of compliance with strategic arms treaties is abysmal. They cheat whenever they can and wherever they can get away with it.
I think it's far too simplistic to say rely on technology versus paper. If you rely purely on technology, you'll have an unrestrained arms race. And nobody can view that as a stable world.
President Reagan's original goals for strategic defense anticipated a reduction of nuclear weapons. But the Soviet Union has repeatedly stated that it will not reduce its offensive missiles if the U.S. builds a defensive system.
If we're speaking of the deployment of anti-ballistic missiles defense, of course it excludes the reduction of offensive weapons. It's just very simple.
SDI is real arms control, because what you do is you take this most awesome of weapons and you make it less useful, and there will be fewer of them. And you can see it happening. Before our very eyes, the Soviets show up and say, oh, yeah, we'll get rid of half of these things. Why? Well, not because they suddenly turn nice. It's because even the Soviet marshals know that for their purposes, they're better off with half the number of weapons enjoying a free ride to American targets than 4 times the number of weapons with a defense of the way.
SDI is what brought the Soviets back to arms control talks at Geneva and Iceland. SDI is the key to a world without nuclear weapons.
While President Reagan sees SDI as a pathway to disarmament, others see SDI as a pathway to an intensified arms race. Our fourth option seeks to transcend deterrence, not by a technological fix, but by ending the arms race altogether, by disarmament. Deterrence is seen as an immoral and dangerous way to secure our long-term survival. Disarmament advocates question how long the world can rely on the threat of annihilation to prevent war. History offers only bleak counsel. Virtually every weapon invented has eventually been used. If deterrence fails, the nuclear weapons we've invented would likely be used, unleashing a catastrophe beyond any in history. The advocates of nuclear disarmament argue that today, after the serious discussion of abolishing all nuclear weapons at the 1986 Reykjavik summit, the idea of nuclear disarmament is no longer easily dismissed, though it may still be a distant goal.
If anybody were to say, in the name of national security, we should burn a young woman at the stake named Joan, people would say that person probably ought to be gently led to a mental hospital. But if somebody were to say, in the name of national security, we should be prepared to burn tens of millions of human beings, that person is highly electable to the highest office in the land.
It's absurd to live under the threat of a nuclear war forever, and it's perfectly obvious that our goal should be to get rid of nuclear weapons, and that our strategies should be, our arms control strategy and our military strategy should be oriented in that direction.
You cannot remove science from this earth. You can remove the arms race. If there is no arms race in which these technical inventions can be applied, then you've solved the problem. And the only way to solve it is to just get rid of those weapons altogether.
The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 immediately gave rise to efforts to rid the world of this new weapon of mass destruction. The earliest effort was the proposal put forth at the United Nations in 1946 by Special U.S. Negotiator Bernard Baruch.
We propose this. 1. Manufacture of atomic bombs shall stop. 2. Existing bombs shall be disposed of pursuant to the terms of the treaty. And 3. The authorities shall be in possession of full information as to the know-how for the production of atomic knowledge.
The Baruch Plan was rejected in an atmosphere of increasing U.S.-Soviet mistrust. But despite the Cold War, aspirations for disarmament continued to be voiced.
Disarmament with mutual honor and confidence is a continuing imperative. Together we must learn how to compose differences, not with arms, but with intellect and decent purpose.
Today, every inhabitant of this planet must contemplate the day when this planet may no longer be habitable. Every man, woman, and child lives under a nuclear sword of Damocles, hanging by the slenderest of threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accident or miscalculation or by madness. The weapons of war must be abolished before they abolish us.
The best way to begin disarming is to begin, and we shall hear any plan, go any place, make any plea, and play any part that offers a realistic prospect for peace.
The leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union faced the daily possibility that they might personally have to risk the destruction of civilization. Their anguish is understandable. But Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev surprised the world when they discussed the distant possibility of actually eliminating all nuclear weapons at Reykjavik, Iceland in 1986.
We proposed the most sweeping and generous arms control proposal in history. We're closer than ever before to agreements that could lead to a safer world without nuclear weapons.
The dismantling of nuclear missiles as prescribed in the INF and proposed START agreements is welcomed by disarmament advocates as a good first step. But to reduce to zero, they say that conventional weapons will have to be cut as well.
Now, if two powers with the knowledge of how to make nuclear weapons start going at it in conventional weapons, it is not realistic to think that one is going to lose gracefully rather than cranking up the nuclear weapons. So it's probably fair to say that not only is nuclear war out, but probably all war is out. Humanity has outlived war, just doesn't know it yet.
As long as you have the two superpowers maintaining huge standing conventional armies and using them to advance their interests in various parts of the world, certainly under those conditions I think we couldn't get rid of nuclear weapons. So one of the conditions we would need to see is to have these huge armies with very aggressive potential or long-range offense potential cut way back to very small forces, let's say border guards, which really don't have the capability to commit aggression.
Stopping the proliferation of nuclear weapons technology is seen as another necessary step toward disarmament.
The two superpowers export their most sophisticated weapons, export nuclear technology, export their whole confrontation to the third world. What this means is that we are creating our own future threats. We are arming countries and regions which sooner or later will threaten us either directly or indirectly.
If we don't stop proliferation, Mother Earth is going to become a nuclear porcupine.
And then let's carry it further, because that's inevitable. What's going to happen? Nuclear bombs will be about the size of a softball. You can hide them in an attache's case, in the tutus of the Bolshoi Ballet.
A last step on the way to disarmament requires building new ways to resolve disputes so that nations will not have to resort to the use of force. Disarmament advocates see the need to strengthen international institutions such as the UN.
The United Nations has not let down the world. The nations of the world have let down the United Nations. We haven't used the means for resolving conflict that are there, available in the United Nations. We have to start using them. In other words, as we begin to bring down arms and we begin to recognize that we have to find other means of solving conflicts, we're going to begin to go more and more international. And all that is very much, I think, to the good.
We would see multinational forces capable of being used in a small scale to deal with nations that would, let's say, restart nuclear industries or begin building long-range air forces or ocean-going navies, to apply economic sanctions, political sanctions, and ultimately military force as means of dealing with these violations of international norms.
Those who favor the abolition of nuclear weapons say that changing economic and political conditions now make it possible to move beyond rhetoric to concrete action. President Reagan's early years in office were marked by harsh rhetoric about the Soviet Union.
Let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world.
In 1988, after 4 superpower summits, President Reagan paints a different picture of the Soviet Union.
Quite possibly, we're beginning to take down the barriers of the post-war era. Quite possibly, we're entering a new era in history, a time of lasting change in the Soviet Union.
The Soviet people have boldly taken the path of radical reform and development in all spheres: economic, social, political, and intellectual. Democratization and glasnost are the decisive prerequisites for the success of those reforms.
I think the world is now seeing that Mr. Gorbachev is a genuine reformer. And those of us who know Russian history know that reformers come rarely, and rarely last long. So it behooves us Americans not to spurn his office, but to test their sincerity.
It's clear that the Cold War is not just ending, but over. We're living in a different era in international relations.
Geoeconomics has replaced geopolitics. And economic considerations are going to turn the arms race around. Because just as the Soviet Union has to revitalize its stagnant economy, we have to do the same.
We already see that while two great powers are competing in armaments, many nations like Japan, Germany are doing amazing things in world economy, and I think we have to be hurry to catch up.
We're now #1 when it comes to warheads and bombs. 359 bases, whatever it is, in 40 countries. We're also #5 when it comes to literacy in the world. We're #8 when it comes to life expectancy. And get this, we're #18 in the world when it comes to infant mortality.
The U.S. and the Soviet Union each spend about $300 billion a year on the military. The world spends over $1 trillion. While much of that money could be spent on other pressing needs, the critics of disarmament argue that eliminating nuclear weapons in today's world is simply not feasible.
You can fit a nuclear weapon of explosive power far greater than Hiroshima and Nagasaki put together in the trunk of your car. No trouble. You could even put a couple of them in there. Are you going to assure me that there aren't 10 of those, or 20, hidden in the Soviet Union? Realize they have on the order of 25,000 now. Also, what would be the incentive to other countries if the nuclear weapon states that now have nuclear weapons were to get rid of all of their nuclear weapons? Think how valuable it would be to have 10 if you knew the United States had none and the Soviets had none.
The whole world has to buy into international inspection of a stringent order, or the whole world, or any reluctant nations, can expect stringent international sanctions, because this is too serious to fool around with.
I don't think it's utopian. I don't think it's impossible. I don't think it's something we shouldn't think about. If we don't think about it and we don't work on it in a conscious way, it clearly won't happen.
We'll never know if everybody's going to come along until we get started. But to say there's no way to do it without ever trying, that's cowardice. And it's also the counsel of despair, because that really is relegating the world then to eventually to its annihilation.
People won't forget how to make the weapons. This isn't really eliminating them. It's just increasing the mobilization time. Unless you're going to kill all the scientists and engineers and burn all the books, we know how to make them. We can make them again.
If war did break out, and even if nuclear war broke out, and even if nations did cheat, they wouldn't have the sort of arsenals that could end the world. Therefore, all the powers of diplomacy, of politics, of public pressure could come into play in such a world, whereas in today's world they are completely foreclosed and negated. Because once the missiles start to fly in our world, 15 minutes later it's over. There's just no chance for sanity to revive and prevail.
You speak to some Europeans about how's about this world without nuclear weapons, they say, yes, I remember that. 1939. What ensued without nuclear weapons was World War II with about 50 million people dying. No thank you. I'd rather have some risk of nuclear war, very small, in order to prevent the high likelihood that we would have global conventional wars.
There is a certain security and a certain stability that flows from the possession of nuclear weapons on both sides, because it obviously makes it profitless for either side to engage in any kind of major aggression. I think that's true. But the question is it worthwhile to pay the price of holding our entire species in peril of its imminent destruction in order to obtain this stability?
Albert Eden once said, nations and people really do the right and wise thing, but only after exhausting all alternatives. I think we've exhausted all alternatives. I think we've seen now that an arms race, instead of providing more security, has provided less security.
Today's world of 50,000 nuclear weapons is far different from the one 4 decades ago that greeted nuclear weapons as bringing a war to an end. Today, we fear that these weapons can bring our world to an end. Now, we have reviewed 4 policy options that might lead us out of our predicament: military superiority, arms control, missile defense, disarmament. What kind of world do the experts see?
You can offer drastic reductions, but nuclear weapons are the means, the fundamental, the primal, the ultimate means by which large-scale human conflict is mediated, not conducted, happily enough, but mediated through the present time. Until something replaces that, its superior force and violence, or the world order changes drastically, there will be nuclear weapons around, and they will be the ultimate means of geopolitical power.
It is impossible for a legal document to encompass, to constrain the will of an ingenious Communist Party of the Soviet Union that is bent on achieving the ability to fight and win a war.
We've got a lot better chance of getting rid of the threat of nuclear weapons with our technology than we do through our diplomacy.
We need to work on the political relationship first, try to build the civility into the relationship, try to build roads through arms control in which we agree to disagree on a variety of issues, rather than taking what is essentially a military technical route to trying to solve the problem that nuclear weapons created for us.
If you're ever to move beyond the world in which we can literally destroy the societies of the two sides, the only way to get from here to there is by starting to reduce the size of the arsenals.
I believe
it would be in our interest to move as far as practicable, as far as attainable, back to a non-nuclear world. How far would that be? It would be elimination of all nuclear weapons except a number that would deter one's opponents from secretly building nuclear weapons in violation of the agreement.
If we embrace the goal of full disarmament, this will hugely speed the present negotiations. It will give them energy, it will give them direction, it will give them a goal, and I think they'll go much more quickly than we might have thought.
We'll realize that for all our differences, we still, all of us, breathe and bleed and have children for whom we have aspirations, and we'll begin to celebrate what we have in common rather than fearing so much what we have in conflict, and then maybe we will begin to trust the courage of the people as opposed to the fears of the leaders.
What to do about nuclear weapons is a question not easily decided. The weapons themselves are many in number. The history of their development is complicated, their role in strategy complex, and the result of their use unthinkable. The easiest thing to do is to leave these matters in the hands of experts. But 200 years ago, Americans chose another path. Not the experts, but the people would ultimately decide. We've looked at 4 policy options that can provoke serious discussion about our nuclear future. So far, our journey through the nuclear age has been marked by fear, antagonism, and sometimes despair, justifiably. Now there is a precious moment of opportunity. Do we take it, and to what end?
Major funding for this program was provided by the W. Alton Jones Foundation, the North Shore Unitarian Universalist Beach Program, the Charles A. Fruoff Foundation, the Herman Goldman Foundation, and the Albert A. List Foundation. Additional funding was provided by the following foundations and individuals. You may order a home video cassette of 2WNET for $39.95 plus $2 shipping. For credit card orders, call 1-800-451-7020.